On a cold night in 1991, the quiet city of Birmingham, Alabama, was shattered by a crime so brutal it left even seasoned detectives shaken. 41-year-old Pauline Brown, a young mother with her whole life ahead of her, was attacked, violated, and murdered in her own home. Just blocks away, investigators uncovered yet another horrifying crime, this time involving a 14-year-old girl who barely escaped with her life. The man responsible was eventually identified as Demetrius Terrence Frazier, a name that for decades would strike fear and controversy. His crimes tore families apart, ignited legal battles, and left a trail of unanswered questions that haunted communities across state lines. But more than 30 years later, when the execution chamber doors finally opened for Frazier, what he revealed in his final hours sent shockwaves far beyond Alabama. His last words weren't just an apology. They were a cryptic accusation that hinted at a possible wrongful confession and perhaps another dark secret buried forever. Tonight, we dive into the final 24 hours of Demetrius Frazier, the meals, the visits, the final breath, and the chilling revelations that may have changed everything. Stay with me until the very end, because what he said before dying will leave you questioning the meaning of justice itself. And before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Because every week, I bring you true crime stories told in a way you've never heard before. On November 27, 1991, in Birmingham, Alabama, Frazier passed by one of the ground floor apartments in the area when he noticed that the apartment itself had a light on and therefore formulated an intention to commit robbery. Frazier removed the screen from the window and entered through the window. Frazier searched around the apartment and found some money, amounting to $5 or $10 in cash. He then went to another room where he found 40-year-old Pauline Starks Brown asleep. After waking her up, Frazier demanded more money, and she gave him $80 out of her purse. Frazier then threatened her with a gun and forced her to have sexual intercourse with him. Brown begged for her life, and Frazier fired a shot in the back of her head and left the apartment briefly to check if anyone had heard it. When Frazier returned, he found that Brown had died. Frazier searched the apartment for more money, ate some food, and left the apartment. And he also disposed of the gun. The body of Brown was eventually found by Tyrone Mitchell, who was a co-worker and friend of Brown. Mitchell arrived at the home of Brown after the latter, who was supposed to give him a ride to their workplace to attend their work shift, did not show up for work, and he showed concern over her absence. Mitchell and two maintenance men managed to open the window into Brown's apartment, and it led to the discovery of Brown's body, which was lying face down inside the bedroom. At the time of her death, Brown was survived by her two daughters and one grandchild, who was born a few weeks prior to Brown's death. On March 8, 1992, in Detroit, Michigan, Frazier murdered a young girl in midst of a rape attempt. On that date, Frazier confined a 14-year-old runaway girl, Crystal Kendrick, inside an abandoned house, and during the attempt to rape Kendrick, Frazier shot Kendrick to death while she tried to flee from a house. Kendrick's body was found with a bullet wound in her head. According to her friends and guardian, Kendrick was originally a well-behaved girl before her mother abandoned her, in combination with her mother's drug addiction, and Kendrick gradually having gone astray, without the supervision of her mother and relatives. Kendrick's guardians reportedly expressed guilt and sadness for not being able to take better care of Kendrick. Frazier was subsequently named a suspect behind Kendrick's murder, and he was therefore listed on the wanted list of the offense. Frazier remained on the run for murdering the girl. Before his arrest during the same month, he killed his second victim. Upon his arrest, Frazier confessed to killing Brown while in police custody in Michigan. In 1996, Demetrius Frazier stood in an Alabama courtroom, convicted of capital murder for the 1991 rape and death of Pauline Brown. The weight of the verdict echoed like a sentence on his soul, What would his next move be now that the jury had spoken? Despite the charges in Michigan, the courtroom was fixed on the gravity of Brown's murder, with prosecutors presenting an ironclad case based on his own confession and DNA evidence. Each detail stripped away doubt, pushing the jury to a unanimous verdict that would shape his fate. The jury delivered their recommendation: death. It was a moment that felt both final and cruelly uncertain. What hope remained now for the man facing the ultimate punishment? As days turned into months, his lawyers began a battle of appeals, claiming procedural errors and constitutional violations, igniting slivers of hope in an otherwise dark path. Each appeal was a lifeline, and each denial a painful descent back into despair. Through years of legal filings in state and federal courts, Frazier held on to those thin threads of possibility, while the shadows of death row loomed closer. But with each court rejecting his pleas, the legal safety net frayed, and one question rose: would he ever find reprieve, from the courts or from what he had done? Carole Frazier, Frazier's mother, publicly appealed to the Michigan governor for her son to return to Michigan to continue serving the rest of his life sentences for the murder of Kendrick. She stated that her son was a changed man and wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a Michigan prison, but not be put to death in an Alabama prison. Death penalty opponents advocated against the upcoming execution of Frazier, acknowledging that his crimes were especially heinous and inhumane, but stated that his execution was inappropriate on philosophical and legal grounds. On January 31st, 2025, Frazier's lawyers again urged Whitmer to have Frazier sent back to Michigan to continue serving his life sentence. They argued that in another case, convicted killer Clarence Ray Jr. was sentenced to death in another murder trial in California after being sentenced to life without parole by Michigan for first-degree murder, but he was not sent back to California to face execution for another murder, and the district attorney of Michigan at that time stated that as long as the sentences in Michigan were not completed, any Michigan inmates facing capital punishment in another state would not be brought back to the state in question to face her execution. The lawyers argued that the Clarence Ray case contradicted to the extradition agreement of Frazier, whose situation was similar to Ray's but had different outcomes, and therefore asked Whitmer to exercise her authority to enable Frazier to return to Michigan. On October 19, 2024, a request for Frazier's death warrant to be issued was made, and on January 7, 2025, Alabama Governor Ivey scheduled Demetrius Frazier's execution date as February 6, 2025, following an order from the Alabama Supreme Court authorizing the governor to set the date. On February 6, 2025, the clock began ticking on the final day of 52-year-old Demetrius Terrence Frazier's life. By nightfall, he would become the first person executed in Alabama that year, and only the fourth to die by the untested method of nitrogen hypoxia. But before the gas filled the chamber, Frazier carried with him decades of violence, guilt, and secrets that still cast doubt over his story. At exactly 6:10 p.m., the execution procedure began inside Holman Correctional Facility. Witnesses described how Frazier let out a few desperate gasps before his breathing became sporadic, his body stilling just minutes later. By 6:36 p.m., the condemned man was pronounced dead. Yet in those fleeting breaths, the world heard not just his silence, but his final words that left haunting questions behind. "Let's go." Those were the last two words Demetrius Frazier ever spoke. But before that, he offered a statement filled with regret, directed to the family of his victim, 24-year-old Carole Brown. He apologized to the African-American community, admitting Brown's death should never have happened. And then, almost cryptically, he urged the press to investigate a detective in Michigan, claiming he had falsely confessed in the murder of another woman, Crystal Kendrick. Was this the truth or the final deception of a dying man? Hours before his death, Frazier shared one last meal, a fast food feast from Taco Bell. A beefy 5-layer burrito, a chicken chalupa supreme, crunchy tacos, chips and dip washed down with Mountain Dew. He spent his last visit with his mother, his sister, and his attorneys. The quiet moments of love and loyalty clashed with the reality that soon he would be strapped to a chair and deprived of air. Even in these final moments, the question lingered. Did he feel peace, or was he still hiding the weight of untold truths? When it was over, Alabama's leaders wasted no time in declaring justice served. Governor Ivey released a firm statement, insisting that rapists and killers have no place in society and that consequences must be met without exception. Attorney General Steve Marshall called Frazier a monster who left a trail of unspeakable violence. For the state, Frazier's execution was closure, but for his lawyers, it was a bitter failure. They condemned the state of Michigan for not stepping in to protect one of its residents from a death sentence, and they slammed the governor for refusing clemency. As the nitrogen cleared from the chamber and the body of Demetrius Frazier grew still, one truth remained. A man who confessed a murder died, insisting that at least one of his confessions wasn't real. Was justice truly served, or did his final breath carry with it a secret that may never be uncovered?